In my last video, it was shocking to learn that it was the Viet Cong who carried out the devastating August 23, 1968 attack on MACV-SOG's FOB-4, especially since we had believed it was the NVA for over half a century. In SOG, we prided ourselves for fighting the professional North Vietnamese army in Laos and Cambodia. We considered the Viet Cong amateurs. That was a result of our training and a military leadership that completely misunderstood the enemy they were fighting, a misunderstanding that cost thousands of lives and ended in disaster. Most of our military education on the enemy in Vietnam can be summed up in two words: punji sticks. Stateside instructors who prepared us for battle were obsessed with punji sticks. They trucked us to a distant range to look at a hole in the ground with sharp sticks planted in the bottom. They described the enemy as farmers by day, fighters by night, running around in black pajamas, planting punji sticks and booby traps and ambushing our patrols. In sharp contrast, we were taught, with little detail, that the enemy of real concern lurked north of the DMZ and in their remote sanctuaries of Laos and Cambodia. The North Vietnamese Army, hardcore conventional infantry made up of well-trained and disciplined soldiers backed up by heavy artillery who could potentially surge across the borders like the Chinese in Korea. Fact was, it didn't make any difference if the enemy that inflicted the greatest single-day loss on U.S. Special Forces in history fought under the NVA or the VC flag. It was the best unit for the mission. In May of 1968, with over 2 years of the most intense training the U.S. Army had to offer, I arrived in Vietnam just after the Tet Offensive, the countrywide uprising of the Viet Cong, which shocked the American people. A dozen infiltrators on the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon became the symbol of American weakness. The weeks-long struggle of fierce fighting to dislodge the VC from the city of Hue displayed the resolve of our enemy. General Westmoreland, the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, mistakenly believed that the Viet Cong offensive was just an attempt to divert attention away from the real battle in the north, where U.S. Marines were under siege by the North Vietnamese Army. The attacks, he said, had been put down at great cost to the Viet Cong. The victory rang hollow with the American people. We had defeated the peasants, but our troops would still have to face the North Vietnamese Army. To most observers, it was hardly an upgrade in the situation. Both Westmoreland and the public greatly underestimated the magnitude of the victory. They were victims of the Viet Cong myth, carefully crafted by the enemy over the years. After the French were defeated and Vietnam was partitioned in 1954, 90,000 Viet Minh fighters from the south relocated to the north. In 1959, the Central Committee made the decision to reunify the country by force. They created the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVIN, to control the war and began sending main force units made up of ex-Viet Minh and NVA troops to the south. At COSVIN's direction, the National Liberation Front had established local militias, the Punji Stick people, in rural districts, known immediately as the Viet Cong. They controlled the local population and harassed government troops. But more importantly, they provided recruits, supplies, and local support for the arriving main force units. Soon there were legitimate international outcries of a northern invasion. In order to shift attention away from the main force infiltration, COSVIN ordered the front's propaganda machine to highlight the Viet Cong as a ragtag band of poor rice farmers who were willing to sacrifice their lives to reunite their country. The front produced documentaries and posters featuring poorly armed resistance fighters building and installing crude booby traps and initiating daring jungle ambushes against far superior ARVN and American forces. Women played a large role in the Viet Cong resistance, and the front quickly learned that featuring them evoked sympathy from the West that instinctively favored the underdog. The campaign was successful. In the media, and unbelievably even in military classrooms, the war in the South became defined as a battle between determined farmers and sophisticated conventional armies. The portrayal was nonsense. By 8 March 1965, the day 3,500 U.S. Marines, who had no doubt had their fair share of punji stick training, came ashore at Da Nang, a battle-hardened 150,000-man main force army was firmly in place within the borders of South Vietnam. By 1965, the main force units numbered 7 full divisions and many independent regiments. Fully a third of the troops had been imported from the north. 10% were deserters from ARVN units. Many of those had enlisted for the specific purpose of deserting after training. The rest had been locally recruited. Main force combat units were the backbone of the North's military efforts, acting as mobile, highly trained formations capable of engaging in large-scale battles against South Vietnamese and American forces. In exchange for the vast amount of military material the Chinese were providing the North, they demanded liaison personnel be embedded with COSVN to monitor their progress. In reports to their superiors, they consistently described the Viet Cong main force as a highly effective light infantry army. It was their combat effectiveness that led to the introduction of U.S. troops. Initially armed with weapons left over from the war with the French, the North made significant efforts to arm the main force units with AK-47s. By the mid-60s, most regiments had heavy weapons battalions, including 57mm recoilless rifles, 12.7mm heavy machine guns, and 82mm mortars. Sapper battalions made up of highly trained infiltration and explosive experts were proven to be effective against fixed positions. Except for their lack of heavy artillery, which would have greatly reduced their mobility, the main force units were considered on par with the North Vietnamese army. In fact, many of the more adventurous NVA soldiers, tired of sitting on their butts in Laos and Cambodia, volunteered for main force duty to be where the action was. As more and more American forces arrived in South Vietnam during 1966, the Viet Cong main force rapidly adapted to the new mobile helicopter tactics. Though they suffered significant casualties, the rate was far below replacement. By the beginning of 1967, the Americans were disappointed with their progress. At the same time, COSVN was alarmed as the Americans built a chain of strongpoints below the DMZ. Fearing the Americans would strike into Laos, cutting their vital supply lines, COSVN petitioned the government in the north for permission to launch massive attacks on the cities in the south, which they believed would rally the people to their side and end the war. The senior leadership of the People's Army was vehemently opposed to the plan, preferring a go-slow approach. Discussions were heated, with both sides questioning each other's loyalty. Finally, the Pilot Bureau sided with COSVN and agreed to launch the offensive. Many high-ranking officers in the People's Army who opposed the attacks were purged. In the last days of January 1968, the main force, now 200,000 strong, with NVA troops in supporting roles, launched their attacks. The results are best summed up by a senior Viet Cong general. "We suffered large sacrifices. Our troops were decimated, and our units were crippled." North Vietnamese Communist leadership viewed the Tet Offensive as a disaster. More than 50,000 men, the vast majority from the main force units, were killed and 60,000 wounded. The level of combat effectiveness they had attained would never be repeated. The Allied side suffered 9,000 combatants killed. The American people, who were totally bought in on the hoax of the Viet Cong as a bunch of ragtag farmers, saw the fact that such a force could attack and occupy Vietnam's largest cities, no matter how briefly, as proof that the U.S. was backing a corrupt South Vietnamese government against the will of the Vietnamese people. U.S. military leaders who had lost credibility by misrepresenting the situation on the ground in Vietnam over the years found it impossible to convince the American people that the Tet Offensive was a great Allied victory. It was left to Walter Cronkite to explain the Vietnam situation.
But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out will be to negotiate not as victims, but as an honorable people.
From there, things got even more ludicrous. As the losses suffered by the Viet Cong became better known, so-called experts whose reputations were invested in a communist victory assured us that the destruction of the Viet Cong was in fact a North Vietnamese plot to eliminate those who could become their future opposition, which with any scrutiny makes no sense at all, because a third of the force and the majority of those killed during the offensive were reinforcements from the North Vietnamese army. The magnitude of the defeat cannot be overstated. During the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong suffered more casualties in a single campaign than at any other time in Vietnam's centuries-long history of warfare, with the only exception being the Ming Dynasty invasion of 1406. So the fate of the war that began with a lie in the Gulf of Tonkin would be sealed with the lie of the Tet Offensive. The destruction of the Viet Cong main force, the backbone of the communist insurgency, would also destroy America's will to pursue victory, as our political officials negotiated Cronkite's honorable way out. Another 28,000 Americans would die. You will find my book Dawson's War worthwhile. Rather than just accounts of MACV-SOG's various missions, Dawson's War is the story of 5 men, 3 Americans and 2 Brew Mountain Yard mercenaries. I'll take you with us for a year. You'll get your fair share of gunfights in Laos, because we did. But SOG was so much more than gunfights. SOG was a brotherhood, and unless you experience the camaraderie we shared, you can't really know SOG. Through Dawson's War, these 5 men will become your friends, and like we do, you'll miss them when it's over. In the end, you'll be able to answer SOG's most asked question: what kind of men ran these dangerous missions? Get a copy today at Amazon. Hey, do me a favor, like and subscribe. It helps. Thanks.